On the 4th of March, 2024, the oldest factory in the United States still making the product it was built to make went dark. It stood at 14 Heffler Avenue in Ilion, New York, a small town in the Mohawk Valley that existed because of that factory. Remington had been making firearms on that ground since before the repeating rifle, before the self-contained cartridge, before most of the states west of the Mississippi were states at all. 208 years. It had armed the Union in the Civil War, filled contracts for the Tsar of Russia, survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and a dozen changes of ownership. And it was killed by none of those things. The notice came in a letter to the Union 3 months earlier, just before Christmas. The company informed the United Mine Workers that it would close its entire operation in Ilion on or about the 4th of March. The Union's international president read the timing, layoffs of the last workers scheduled for the days after the holiday, and gave it the only headline it deserved. He called it, in a public statement, "Merry Christmas from Rem Arms." At the end, the plant that had once employed thousands had about 270 people left. When it closed, the building, 1.1 million square feet of it, sat empty until a property developer from Florida bought it. The company that made America's oldest gun moved what was left of itself to Georgia. Remington did not die because someone built a better rifle. Remington died because of debt, and because the men who owned it, again and again across 2 centuries, chose the money over the thing the name was supposed to mean. The story of how a blacksmith's son built a company that outlived the nation's every war, and how that company was strip-mined, dismembered, and sold for parts, is the story of the widest gap in American manufacturing between a name and the thing the name once stood for. Every week we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms brands. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins in a forge in 1816. Eliphalet Remington II was 23 years old, the son of a man who ran a forging operation in the hill country of central New York. The legend, and it is worth being honest that it is partly legend, runs like this. Young Eliphalet wanted a rifle. His father would not buy him one, and so the boy used his father's water-driven trip hammers to forge himself a barrel out of scrap iron. He then walked to a gunsmith in nearby Utica, roughly 10 miles away, who reamed and rifled the bore. He built the rifle, took it to a shooting match, finished second, and left the field with so many orders from the other shooters that he was, without quite meaning to be, in the gun business. Most serious historians think the gunsmith in Utica probably finished the actual rifle, because it is doubtful a farm boy had the tools or the training to do it alone. And for years afterward, Remington did not even make complete guns. He made barrels. Other gunmakers bought them and fitted them to their own actions. That is worth holding on to, because it is the first quiet truth of this company. Remington's genius was never a single famous invention. It was manufacturing. It was making a good thing, in quantity, better and cheaper than the men around him. His real innovation was not a rifle at all. In 1816, a gun barrel was made by heating iron and beating it around a mandrel with sledgehammers, strong men, high heat, and hours of muscle. Remington figured out how to put the trip hammers of his father's forge to the work, taking the hand labor out of barrel making. That was the whole company in miniature. Water power, precision, volume. By 1828, the little forge had outgrown itself. Remington bought 100 acres on the banks of the Erie Canal at a spot on the Mohawk River that would be incorporated as the village of Ilion. The canal had opened 3 years earlier. It gave a barrel maker in the middle of New York State cheap access to distant markets and cheap raw material coming the other way. The modern Remington factory would still occupy that ground almost 2 centuries later. The same year they moved, the family was struck. Eliphalet's father, the man who owned the forge, fell under the wheel of a wagon loaded with timber and died of his injuries 5 days later. Young Eliphalet carried on, installed a second forge to keep up with demand, and turned a barrel business into a rifle business. The first real money came from war. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico, and the U.S. Navy awarded Remington a contract for 1,000 carbines. It was the first of the military orders that would define the company for the next 100 years. An Army contract followed for 10,000 percussion rifles. The factory grew, and the town grew with it. By the outbreak of the Civil War, E. Remington and Sons, the Sons had joined the business by 1840, was one of the leading arms makers in the country. It made revolvers, the new model Army and Navy, and thousands of the percussion rifles the Union put in its soldiers' hands. Eliphalet Remington II did not live to see what his company became. He died in 1861, at the age of 67, in the first year of the Civil War, the war that would turn his firm into an industrial power. He built the thing and died just as it was about to become an empire, and he never saw a dollar of what it grew into. Remember that. It is the pattern of this entire story, set down at the very start. The man and the name do not travel together for long. After the war, the company reached for something bigger than guns. And that reach, the same reach that would end it a century and a half later, nearly ended it the first time. The post-war decades were, for a while, a golden age. Remington's great commercial weapon of the era was the rolling block, a single-shot rifle with an action so simple, so strong, and so cheap to make that it became one of the most widely exported military rifles in the world. Governments across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Latin America bought it by the hundreds of thousands. For a time, E. Remington and Sons was arming the armies of nations that most Americans could not have found on a map. But the family did not stop at guns. Flush with success, they diversified, aggressively. Remington made sewing machines, it made agricultural equipment, it made fire engines, and in 1873, it began manufacturing something that would outlast every gun it ever built, the first commercially successful typewriter. That machine, the Scholes and Glidden, carried a keyboard layout Remington helped standardize, the QWERTY arrangement your keyboard still uses today, more than a century and a half later. Here is the problem, and it is a problem you will watch this company make again and again until it finally kills them. A name that means one thing does not automatically sell another. Remington meant firearms. The sewing machines and the typewriters and the farm gear competed against companies that had spent their own decades building authority in those markets. The ventures drained capital. And at the same time, the flood of military contracts that had carried the firm since the Mexican War slowed to a trickle in a country no longer at war. By the mid-1880s, E. Remington and Sons was insolvent. In 1886, the typewriter business was spun off. It would eventually become Remington Rand, a name that would go on to build early computers and put the Remington label on electric razors. A business with no connection to firearms whatsoever, which is its own small proof of how far a name can drift from the thing that made it. And on the 7th of March, 1888, the Remington family sold the company. The buyer was Marcellus Hartley, one of the founders of the Union Metallic Cartridge Company, the men who made the ammunition Remington's guns fired. That date matters more than almost any other in this story. From 1888 onward, for the remaining 136 years of its existence, no one named Remington owned or ran Remington. America's oldest gunmaker, the great family name of the American arms industry, spent the overwhelming majority of its life as a name in other men's hands. The company and the family had parted ways for good. What was left was a brand, and a brand, unlike a family, can be bought, sold, borrowed, mortgaged, and eventually taken apart. Hartley restored the company and steered it into the 20th century. He died in 1902, and control passed to his grandson, Marcellus Hartley Dodge. In 1910, Remington Arms and the Union Metallic Cartridge Company were merged into a single firm, Remington UMC, the gun and the cartridge under one roof. And then came the war that nearly destroyed the whole thing, delivered from 5,000 miles away by a revolution Remington had nothing to do with. By 1915, The Russian army was being cut to pieces on the Eastern Front, in part because it did not have enough rifles. The Tsar's government could not build them fast enough at home, so it went shopping in America. It placed an enormous order with Remington UMC, 1.5 million Mosin Nagant rifles, a Russian bolt-action design, plus bayonets and 100 million rounds of ammunition. It placed a second order, larger still, with another American firm, New England Westinghouse. Remington built new capacity, hired, tooled up, and began turning out rifles chambered for a Russian cartridge, marked with the double-headed eagle of the Romanov Tsars. Consider the exposure in that arrangement. Every one of those rifles was built to a Russian pattern, in a Russian caliber, that no American army used and no American civilian wanted. The entire value of the contract depended on one customer, on another continent, staying solvent and staying in power. He did neither. In 1917, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. Russia left the war. The new government refused to pay for the rifles still sitting in Remington's warehouses. By the summer of 1918, Remington had produced about 852,000 Mosin Nagants and was staring at a catastrophic loss, holding a mountain of rifles it could not sell for a buyer that no longer existed. What saved the company was Washington. Having entered the war itself in 1917, the U.S. government bought the warehoused rifles, tens of thousands of them, and used them to train the army it was rapidly expanding. Remington still lost a considerable sum and waited years for the government to pay its bill, but it survived. A firm nearly killed not by a competitor, not by a bad product, but by a revolution it had no part in. The second time the reach for a huge outside opportunity had nearly taken the whole company down. The interwar years and the middle of the 20th century were the most stable in Remington's history, and the reason was a new owner with deep pockets. In 1933, the chemical giant DuPont acquired a controlling interest, and in 1934, the firm was reorganized as the Remington Arms Company. DuPont was not a private equity fund looking to flip an asset. It was an industrial corporation that made gunpowder and had held a stake in Remington for years, and it ran the company as a manufacturer for the long term. It would own Remington for 60 years, and under DuPont, Remington built the guns that made the name legendary to ordinary Americans. In 1950 came the Model 870 pump-action shotgun, one of the best-selling shotguns ever made, a fixture in duck blinds, police cruisers, and bedroom closets for generations. And in 1962 came the one that mattered most, the Model 700 bolt-action rifle. Accurate, smooth, affordable, endlessly adaptable. It became the best-selling bolt-action rifle in American history. More than 5 million were made. Police departments used it. The United States military built its sniper rifles on its action. For millions of hunters, a Remington meant a 700, and a 700 meant you had bought the best. But inside that masterpiece was a flaw. And the story of that flaw is the clearest window in this entire history into what Remington's owners valued and what they didn't. At the heart of the Model 700's fire control was a mechanism designed by a Remington engineer named Merle Mike Walker, patented in 1950. The Walker trigger was, in one sense, a genuine advance. It gave the smooth, crisp, light pull that expert shooters prized, at a price ordinary buyers could afford. But its design included one unusual part: a small, free-floating piece of metal, roughly the length of a paperclip, called the trigger connector, held against the trigger body by a spring and not fixed to it. Here is one sentence of why that matters, and it is a sentence about a man on a hunt. Because the connector floats, a gap can open between it and the trigger body during the firing cycle. Dirt, dried lubricant, or grit can lodge in that gap and keep the connector from returning to its safe position. When that happens, the rifle can fire without anyone touching the trigger, the instant the safety is pushed off, or the bolt is closed, or the gun is simply jarred. And a rifle that fires when no one has pulled the trigger fires into whatever the muzzle happened to be pointing at: a truck, a hillside, the person walking in front. The most damning detail is not the flaw. It is the sequence. According to accounts drawn from internal documents and later court cases, Walker himself proposed a safer trigger design in 1948, while the rifle's predecessor was still being tested. The company rejected it, because the safer version would have added a few cents to the cost of each gun. The most cited figure is roughly 5.5 cents. Internal concern about inadvertent discharges is documented from at least the 1970s. Remington set up a product safety committee, studied the complaints, and declined to recall the rifle, on the reasoning that the defect was estimated to affect only about 1% of the millions of guns sold. 1% of millions is still a very large number of rifles. Over the years, at least 24 deaths and more than 100 serious injuries were linked to inadvertent discharges of the 700 series. Among them was a 9-year-old boy in Montana, killed in 2000 when his mother's Model 700 fired as she was unloading it on a family hunting trip. She was certain her hand was nowhere near the trigger. In 2010, the network CNBC aired an investigative documentary, Remington Under Fire. A class action settlement years later saw the company agree to replace the triggers in some 7.85 million rifles, while continuing to insist the design was not defective, and framing the fix as a way to avoid the cost and uncertainty of endless litigation. The engineer, Mike Walker, lived to 101. He lived long enough to say, on the record, that he had warned them. That is the through line of this company laid bare in a single part. A decision to save a nickel and a half per gun, defended for half a century, paid for by other people. Hold it in mind, because Remington's owners were about to make the same kind of choice on a scale that would end the company. In 1993, DuPont sold Remington. After 60 years, the industrial parent that had run it as a manufacturer let it go to an investment group, Clayton, Dubilier, and Rice. That was the hinge. From here forward, Remington was owned not by gunmakers or chemical companies, but by finance, by people whose relationship to the firm was measured in returns, not rifles. The fatal turn came in 2007, when the private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management bought Remington and folded it into a holding company it called the Freedom Group. Cerberus went on a buying spree, rolling up a large share of the American gun industry under one roof: the rifle maker Bushmaster, the lever-action legend Marlin, the AR-15 maker DPMS, and others. It became the largest firearms conglomerate in the nation, later renamed Remington Outdoor Company. And it was built the way private equity builds things, on debt, loaded onto the company itself, with management fees flowing out to the owners. For a while, the strategy printed money. Then came the two blows that private equity had no answer for. The first arrived on the 14th of December 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut. A gunman used a Bushmaster AR-15 style rifle, a rifle made by a company Remington owned, to murder 21st graders and 6 educators at Sandy Hook Elementary School. In 2014 and 2015, families of 9 of the victims sued. Their claim was narrow and precisely aimed. Not that the gun was defective, but that Remington had marketed a military-style weapon to civilians recklessly, targeting young, at-risk men in ways that violated Connecticut's trade practices law. One of the ads the case surfaced showed the rifle with the line, "Consider your man card reissued." For years, American gunmakers had been almost impossible to sue over the criminal use of their products, shielded by a 2005 federal law. Remington fought the case hard and long. It lost the fight to have it dismissed, and in February 2022, it settled for $73 million, the full extent of its insurer's coverage. It was the first time in the United States that a gun manufacturer had been held to account in a mass shooting. As part of the settlement, the families won the right to release thousands of pages of the company's internal marketing documents. The mother of one 6-year-old victim called it a day of accountability for an industry that has thus far enjoyed operating with immunity and impunity. The second blow was the arithmetic. The debt Cerberus had loaded onto Remington was unforgiving the moment revenue softened, and the gun market did soften. In March 2018, Remington Outdoor filed for bankruptcy. It reorganized, emerged 2 months later, and carried out too much of the same debt to survive. With sales falling, creditors pressing, and the Sandy Hook settlement looming, the company went back into court in 2020. This time, there was no reorganization. In a bankruptcy auction that September, America's oldest gunmaker was sold off in pieces. Look at what in pieces actually meant, because it is the most literal dismemberment of a brand in American industry. The ammunition business went to Vista Outdoor, to be run as Remington Ammunition. The firearms business, minus Marlin, went to a group called Roundhill, which organized it as Remarms and licensed the Remington name from the company that now owned the ammunition. Marlin went to Sturm, Ruger. The Barnes ammunition line went to Sierra. DPMS, H&R, Advanced Armament, and other brands went to another buyer. The famous name did not pass to a successor. It was divided among strangers. And this produced the strangest afterlife imaginable. There are now 2 separate companies, owned by 2 unrelated ownership groups, both using the name Remington, both claiming the same 1816 heritage, both pointing to the same blacksmith's forge, one selling ammunition, the other selling guns, with no control over each other. The ammunition side has since passed again, into the hands of a large Czech-based defense and industrial group. The name has been fractured so completely that the two halves compete to tell the same 200-year-old story. Which brings us back to Ilion and the last act. Roundhill's Remarms took over the historic plant and, for a couple of years, kept it running. The workers there, in the union's words, the people who let the company rise from the ashes of the bankruptcy. But the economics of an old, expensive plant in upstate New York, against modern facilities in cheaper states, were the same economics that were pulling gunmakers south all over the country. In late 2023, Remarms announced it would close Ilion entirely and move everything to LaGrange, Georgia. On the 4th of March, 2024, after 208 years, the machines in Ilion stopped. The building was listed for sale, sat empty, and was bought by a Florida property developer. 2 centuries of continuous production in one town ended not with a battle lost, but with a real estate transaction. The name did not stay in the rubble either. Remington Ammunition is still made and sold in every sporting goods store in the country, now under foreign ownership. Remington firearms, the Model 700, the Model 870, are still built, now in Georgia, by Remarms. Marlin lever guns are made by Ruger, and, in a fracture older than any of these, the Remington name still sits on electric razors sold in drugstores. A leftover of the typewriter business spun off in 1886, connected to the gun company only by a word. The brand survived. It survived by scattering. On the collector market, the actual objects tell a cleaner story than any of the corporate paperwork. Original 19th century Remington rolling blocks and revolvers, Civil War contract arms, the American-made Mosin Nagants, with their Tsarist eagles and Remington markings. Early DuPont-era 700s and 870s, these are actively collected and hold real value, precisely because they were made in a place and by a workforce that no longer exists. What is prized is not the name on the box that the name has become. It is the work that the name used to mean. Here is the detail the 200-year story tends to bury. For most of its life, the Remington family gunmaker had no Remington in it. The founder died in 1861, before the company was great, and never owned what it became. His family was gone from the business by 1888, 136 years before the last factory closed. There is even a strange grace note in the family name. The artist Frederick Remington, whose paintings and bronzes did more than almost anything to fix the image of the American West, the cowboy, the cavalry, the frontier the rifles helped settle, was, by most accounts, a relative of the gun-making Remingtons, a cousin. The name that armed the West and the name that painted it were the same name, but the man who built the company was gone before the myth was made, and the family was gone before the century turned. What the Remington story really tells is not a story about guns. It is a story about the difference between a company and a name. A company is a place and a workforce and a body of knowledge that lives in specific hands. The men in Ilion who knew how a barrel should feel, how a trigger should break, what a good gun sounds like when the bolt closes. That company died on the 4th of March, 2024, and most of its knowledge dispersed with the 270 people who were let go the week after Christmas. A name is different. A name can be bought at auction and split in half. A name can be loaded with debt, borrowed against, and sold for parts. A name can sit on a rifle and a box of cartridges owned by two companies that don't speak to each other, and on a razor owned by neither. And a name, unlike a company, feels nothing when its owners decide that a safer trigger costs too much, or that the debt is worth the fees, or that the plant in the town that carries its history is cheaper to close than to keep. Remington was killed by that gap, the gap between the name and the thing. It was never conquered. No rival ever built a better 700. It was hollowed out from the inside by a century and a half of owners who understood the value of the name and forgot the cost of earning it. The founder forged a barrel out of scrap because he could not afford a gun and built something real. The men who ended it owned something real and turned it back into scrap. Somewhere tonight, in a truck on a back road in November, there is a Remington 700 on the rack behind the seat. Blued steel, walnut stock, the bolt closing with that smooth, exact feel that sold 5 million of them. It was probably made in Ilion, in the plant that no longer runs, by people whose names are recorded nowhere a stranger can find them. The stamp on the barrel still reads Remington. The place that put it there is a housing prospect now, owned by a developer in Florida. The rifle still works. It always did. That was never the part that failed. If you want to keep hearing the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the companies that outlived everything except their own owners, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.